Welcome, my friends. Today we begin a long journey into the story of America, a land that has inspired millions and shaped the world in countless ways. Long before it was called the United States, before cities and skyscrapers, before presidents and armies, this land was home to the very first people. Thousands of years ago, groups we now call Native Americans crossed over from Asia, following herds of animals and searching for food. Slowly, they spread across the continent. They built homes, grew corn and beans, hunted bison and deer, and created cultures full of songs, stories, and traditions that connected them deeply with nature. For them, this place was not new. It was home. Then came a moment that changed history. In 1492, an Italian sailor named Christopher Columbus set out across the Atlantic Ocean. He thought he had found a shortcut to Asia, but instead he reached islands in the Caribbean. His voyage was paid for by the King and Queen of Spain, Ferdinand and Isabella. Columbus believed he had reached India, so he called the native people Indians. In truth, he had stumbled into a whole new world. He was not even the first European to arrive. 500 years earlier, Viking explorers led by Leif Erikson had landed in North America, in what is now Canada. Their settlements, however, did not last. Columbus's journey, unlike theirs, captured the attention of Europe. From that moment, the Americas would never be the same. After Columbus, ships from Spain, France, and England rushed to claim land. Spain searched for gold and silver in Central and South America, while England and France sent settlers to North America. With them came animals, plants, and new technologies. But they also carried diseases like smallpox, which spread quickly and destroyed entire native communities. For the native tribes who had lived here for thousands of years, life was about to change forever. In 1607, the English built their first permanent settlement at Jamestown, Virginia. Life was brutally hard. Winters were freezing, food was scarce, and many died of sickness. Yet they survived. More colonies followed. In 1620, another group, the Pilgrims, crossed the ocean on a ship called the Mayflower. They came for religious freedom, to worship in their own way without being punished. They landed in Massachusetts, and with the help of native people who showed them how to grow corn and hunt, they made it through the first winter. To celebrate survival and the harvest, they held a feast that is remembered today as the first Thanksgiving. Slowly, more and more people from Europe came. By the early 1700s, the colonies stretched along the East Coast. To many, America was a land of opportunity, a place to escape poverty and start a new life. But survival was never easy. Families built their own houses, planted crops, and raised animals. Children worked alongside parents. Few schools existed, and only a handful of children learned to read and write. Yet for many settlers, there was hope here they could not find back in Europe. The colonies were very different from one another. In the north, in places like Massachusetts and Connecticut, small farms, fishing, and lumber were common. People lived close together and often worked as communities. In the middle colonies like New York and Pennsylvania, the land was rich and fertile. They grew wheat and grain in such large amounts that the region became known as the breadbasket. Different cultures and religions mixed here, creating a diverse society. In the southern colonies, such as Virginia and Georgia, huge plantations dominated the land. Crops like tobacco, rice, and cotton made wealthy landowners rich. But the work was carried out by enslaved Africans, who were brought across the ocean under terrible conditions and forced to work without freedom. Even as life grew in the colonies, one problem remained. They were still under the rule of Britain. King George III made the laws, and colonists had to pay high taxes to the British government. Yet, they had no voice, no representatives in the British Parliament. This anger grew stronger with each passing year. Colonists began to say a new phrase: no taxation without representation. They meant that they should not be forced to pay taxes if they had no say in how laws were made. One famous protest showed their anger. In 1773, a group of colonists dressed up as Native Americans and secretly boarded British ships in Boston Harbor. They threw chests of tea into the water to resist the tax on tea. This act of rebellion became known as the Boston Tea Party. By the mid-1770s, tensions had reached a breaking point. The colonists wanted to govern themselves, to be free from Britain's control. In 1775, fighting broke out between colonial militias and British soldiers. The American Revolution had begun. The war was risky. Britain had one of the strongest armies in the world. Their soldiers were trained, well-armed, and supported by a powerful navy. The colonists, on the other hand, were farmers, shopkeepers, and craftsmen with little experience. But they had determination. They had leaders who believed in freedom, such as George Washington, who became the commander of the colonial army, and Thomas Jefferson, who put the dream of independence into words. On July 4, 1776, Jefferson and other leaders signed the Declaration of Independence. It announced to the world that the 13 colonies were breaking free from Britain. The Declaration spoke of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness as rights that belonged to every human being. Signing it was dangerous. It meant open rebellion against the most powerful empire of the time. The war dragged on. The colonists fought bravely, using knowledge of their land to surprise British troops. Help came from France, which sent soldiers, weapons, and ships. Slowly, the tide began to turn. In 1781, the Americans won a decisive victory at Yorktown, Virginia. 2 years later, in 1783, Britain finally recognized the United States of America as an independent nation. The dream of a new country had become real. But the work was just beginning. In 1789, George Washington was elected the first president. Leaders wrote the Constitution, a set of rules and principles that would guide the new nation. They built a government based on freedom, equality, and democracy. But in truth, not everyone was included. Enslaved people had no rights. Native Americans were pushed aside. Women had no voice in politics. Equality was promised, but it would take centuries of struggle to even come close to achieving it. Still, the foundation of a new nation was laid. A country born from hope, built by determination, and inspired by the belief that people could govern themselves. The story of America was only at its beginning, and the road ahead would be full of triumphs, conflicts, and challenges that would shape not only the nation, but the world itself. The young United States had won its independence, but freedom was fragile. After the Revolution, the country was poor, uncertain, and divided. 13 states were connected by a loose agreement, but disagreements over money, trade, and power soon caused problems. Leaders realized they needed a stronger system to hold the nation together. In 1787, delegates met in Philadelphia and created the Constitution, a framework that balanced power between the government and the people. To protect individual rights, they added the Bill of Rights, 10 amendments that guaranteed freedoms such as speech, religion, and the press. George Washington became the first president in 1789. He faced the enormous task of turning ideals into reality. The new capital was built along the Potomac River and named Washington, D.C. The young nation was cautious, avoiding wars and focusing on survival. But growth came quickly. People moved west, settling new lands beyond the Appalachian Mountains. Farmers, traders, and pioneers braved forests and rivers, searching for opportunity. In 1803, President Thomas Jefferson made a deal that doubled the nation's size. It was called the Louisiana Purchase, buying land from France that stretched from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains. This opened vast new territories, but it also raised questions. Who would control these lands? How would Native Americans be treated? And would slavery be allowed to expand there? Explorers like Lewis and Clark set out to map the unknown, recording rivers, animals, and encounters with tribes along the way. As the country grew, so did tension with foreign powers. Britain continued to interfere with American trade and even captured sailors to serve in their navy. These actions led to the War of 1812. The fighting was fierce, and the White House itself was burned by British troops. But Americans stood strong, and in battles like New Orleans, they defended their independence. Out of the conflict came a stronger sense of unity and pride in being American. During the 1800s, the idea of manifest destiny took hold. Many believed the United States was destined to stretch from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific. Families loaded wagons and headed west along trails like the Oregon Trail. They faced hunger, disease, and danger. But the dream of land and freedom drove them forward. Towns appeared, railroads expanded, and cities grew. Yet for Native Americans, this westward push brought tragedy. Forced from their homelands, many tribes were relocated under harsh conditions. One of the darkest examples was the Trail of Tears, where thousands of Cherokee people were marched from their lands in the southeast to territory in present-day Oklahoma, and many died along the way. While expansion continued, a deep wound cut through the nation. Slavery had existed since the early colonies, but now it grew into the greatest moral and political conflict of all. In the South, huge plantations depended on enslaved labor to grow cotton, rice, and tobacco. In the North, more people believed slavery was wrong and should be ended. Abolitionists, those who fought to abolish slavery, wrote books, gave speeches, and risked their lives to help enslaved people escape. The Underground Railroad, a secret network of safe houses, guided thousands to freedom in the North and even into Canada. The debate over slavery reached into every decision of the government. Every time a new state joined the Union, arguments erupted. Would it allow slavery or not? The Missouri Compromise tried to keep balance, allowing some states as free and others as slave, but the tension never truly disappeared. In 1860, a tall lawyer from Illinois named Abraham Lincoln was elected president. Lincoln believed the nation could not survive permanently divided between free states and slave states. His election angered the South. One by one, Southern states seceded from the Union, declaring they would form their own country called the Confederate States of America. War was now unavoidable. The Civil War began in 1861 when Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter in South Carolina. The conflict was brutal, the deadliest in American history. Families were torn apart, cities were destroyed, and hundreds of thousands lost their lives. At first, Lincoln's main goal was to keep the Union together. But as the war dragged on, he made a bold move. In 1863, he issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring that enslaved people in the Confederate States were free. Though it did not end slavery everywhere immediately, it turned the war into a fight for human freedom as well as unity. Battles raged across the land. At Gettysburg in 1863, Union forces stopped a Confederate invasion, marking a turning point in the war. Lincoln later stood on that battlefield and gave the Gettysburg Address, a short speech reminding the nation that it was fighting for equality and democracy. He said, "The government of the people by the people, for the people must not perish from the earth." The Union Army slowly gained strength, led by generals like Ulysses S. Grant. In April 1865, Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. The war was over. The Union was saved. Slavery, the deepest scar of the nation, was abolished with the 13th Amendment. But just days after the victory, tragedy struck. Abraham Lincoln was shot by an assassin while attending a play in Washington. The nation mourned the loss of the man who had led them through their darkest hour. The end of the war did not mean peace. The South lay in ruins, and the question of how to rebuild and reunite remained. This period, called Reconstruction, tried to bring change. Freed African Americans gained rights, went to school, and even held political office. But progress was resisted. New laws in the South, known as Jim Crow laws, enforced segregation and denied many rights for decades to come. The promise of equality was far from complete. Yet even in hardship, America kept moving forward. Railroads connected coasts, factories grew, and immigrants from Ireland, Germany, China, and other lands poured in, seeking new lives. The Statue of Liberty, a gift from France, welcomed arrivals in New York Harbor with the words, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free." The nation had endured revolution, expansion, and civil war. It was young, scarred, but stronger. A new chapter of industry, invention, and global influence was beginning.